It's been 17 years since Resident Evil 5 first released, and it's wild saying that because first of all, I feel super old saying that, and second of all, that's a lot of time. Yet even now in 2026, this game remains dear to my heart as it was when I first played it. Many hours were sunk into this game, seeing the ins and outs of it and just having a ton of fun with it. One of my favorite things about Resident Evil 5 is the melee or hand-to-hand system that it adopts. When you get familiar enough with this game, it legitimately becomes, without exaggeration, only half shooter and the other half is brawling. Especially in something like proper mercenaries runs, you don't want to be shooting all the time. You want to be doing as many melee kills as possible because that adds time. And you might think that sounds like Resident Evil 4 Remake or Resident Evil Requiem, but I'll explain why Resident Evil 5 beats those two out in terms of melee variety. And don't worry, I know Resident Evil 6 is a thing as well, and it also has a lot of freedom with melee attacks, but we'll get to that as well, all in due time. I want to emphasize that I'm going to be talking about unique melee attacks that are actually specific to characters themselves. So in Resident Evil 6's case, there's a lot of environmental melee attacks that all look the same no matter who you're playing as. And even though I'm going to talk about stuff like counters, I'm not really going to categorize them in the same category as just simple prompt-based melee attacks. Let me first lay down the groundwork. When you have a normal enemy in front of you in Resident Evil 5, assuming there's no other special variables, you're able to do at least 6 different melee moves that are unique to the character you're playing. This doesn't factor in other options that are available, such as when you're able to combo melee attacks with your partner, which is also a thing, and those result in special powerful melee attacks. So the first most straightforward melee move is done by shooting an enemy in the head and then interacting with them like this. Then you have arm shots, and like some other stuns here, they're indicated by very specific animations that you'll recognize once you're familiar with them. Sometimes you'll do an arm shot, but it doesn't result in the animation that actually allows you to go ahead and melee them. So assuming you've successfully stunned them, you're able to approach them from the front to do another melee attack. And we're still not done with arm shots because they also have a back variant. So you shoot an enemy on the arm, and once you know they're stunned, you can approach them from the back for a different arm melee move. Next is leg shots. When you shoot them on the knee or their thigh, you're able to approach them and do a melee attack. And of course, this also has a back variant that is completely different. And let's say you shot an enemy who tripped and fell. Well, you can run up to them and give them a good ground melee move. In Chris's case, that's a good old-fashioned stomp. So we've just listed 6 different melee moves that assume you haven't done anything special or fulfilled any conditions with a partner. This is already more per character variety than those in Resident Evil 4 Remake and Requiem as well, especially if we don't count the knife or the hatchet, because in those games they are finite resources, and in Resident Evil 5, whenever there's a knife being used in a melee attack, it's not draining any resource from you. Something that I haven't even gotten into yet is that some melee attacks serve very specific purposes. For example, Chris's neck break will prevent any mutations that can happen, which can save you a good amount of ammo or just a headache. For the sake of convenience from here on, let's call these moves parasite killers, and you'll see them across multiple games. Arm shot melee attacks usually are the ones that you want to use if you want your partner to chime in, because these tend to be weaker, and they also don't send the enemy flying so that your partner can actually chain the combo. So you're more likely to complete a string before the enemy dies prematurely, which is also a concern if you want to make sure you get the special finishers. Speaking of special finishers, the most accessible way to do these is, as I said, to first have a partner alongside you, have a single normal enemy in front of you, get an arm stun, go for the attack, wait for your partner to melee them from the back, which is very important because if they don't do this, they basically do a different melee move that ends the string. So if they do their part, you're then able to approach the enemy either from the front or the back to do a special finisher type move that is very powerful. And the fact that it changes based on the direction is really impressive to me. I once again want to emphasize that during the comboing with your partner, the direction matters a lot. If you don't know this, you'll more likely than not mess up the actual combo and it will end up with a different follow-up. If any, even assuming a first-time player even knows that this is a mechanic. Some melee attack compositions will differ based on the enemy, and that subject would take a lot of time to fully go into detail about, so I'll just leave it there. Long story short, there is a different way to approach the different enemies when it comes to melee attacks and which ones you're able to do on them. So factoring in the finishers, each character in Resident Evil 5 has at least 8 unique melee moves that they're able to do. I will count the finishers because there are certain enemies that allow you to do them without the need of a partner. I also didn't factor in the partner assist melee moves, which I probably should have, because once again, each and every single playable character has a unique animation for when they're specifically helping you out of a grab, which is something that Resident Evil 6 doesn't have because they just have the characters use their generic melee attack to bail you out. It doesn't end there in Resident Evil 5 because if your partner bails you out with a melee assist, you're able to follow that up with a combo ender or continuing the chain, which can lead into the finisher if the enemy is still alive for it. Something else I didn't factor in are the special melee attacks almost everyone has received with the gold edition of the game in Mercenaries Reunion specifically. Chris, Sheva, Excella, Josh, Barry, and Rebecca all have a unique move that only shows up if they're paired with a certain partner. In Chris's case, he actually gets 2 new moves. Let's talk about Resident Evil 4 Remake now. This game has a bunch of special cases and exceptions compared to Resident Evil 5's very systematic approach. Resident Evil 5 is very robust when it comes to how to pull off certain melee attacks, and there is little to no room for variables, unlike Resident Evil 4 Remake. So for starters, you still have the head stuns leading into a melee attack, but unlike RE5, the animation can slightly vary even though you're essentially doing the same one attack most of the time. Like, I'm not sure if the damage actually changes depending on which RNG of the animation you get. And the game doesn't really do much to distinguish them, but I think there's 2 animations for the head stun. You're also able to get leg stuns that lead into a melee attack, and weirdly enough, only in Leon and Ada's case, leg stuns have a completely different melee attack when approached from the back. Hunk, Luis, Wesker, and Krauser don't have this luxury, but otherwise everyone has 2 variations of a leg melee attack that I think are just decided randomly, and then Wesker and Ada are the only 2 characters that can do ranged melee attacks. But in Wesker's case, his ranged melee attacks have the same animations as they would if he was close. Unlike Ada, whose ranged melee attack is a completely unique animation. Therefore, Ada gains a point here and Wesker doesn't. Arm stuns in this game don't give you specific melee attacks unique to them, and you can argue that this game didn't really need them since arm stuns in RE5 served the purpose of having a weaker attack that you can chain into a combo with your partner, which only further bolsters the point that RE5's melee system felt very calculated. So in short, every single character has at least 4 unique melee attack animations that are unique to them. Leon has 5 thanks to his suplex, and Ada has 6 thanks to her spinning dive kick and then also the ranged melee attack. I'm not factoring in knife finishers because those work the same way for every playable character minus Wesker. So even though yes, you can finish off an enemy on the floor sometimes with a knife, you have to expend a resource to do it, unlike in RE5 or even RE6, where characters just improvise something in their own flavor. Like Barry will just have unlimited bullets in his trusty Magnum for his ground move. Just leave it to him and don't worry about the ammo. Some of you may be thinking about parrying, and yes, while that's a neat system, the character-to-character variety is non-existent because it also works the same for every character minus Wesker, who has completely unique animations for parrying. And man, I'm glad they did him justice with that because his bare hand parrying is so cool. I'm going to move on to Resident Evil 6 a bit and explain why I find the complexity of that game's melee system to be different compared to Resident Evil 5. There is one major thing in RE6 that gives it most of the complexity that it has, and that's its movement system. RE6 to this day gives you the most freedom when it comes to moving and dodging. It's absolutely unparalleled. You're able to evade while standing, evade to the left, evade to the right, dive backwards, roll to the right, roll to the left, crawl back when on the ground. You're able to do running slides. You're able to chain said running slide into aiming. You're able to chain said running slide into turning back and then aiming. Once again, the movement in Resident Evil 6 is absolutely crazy, and it's still fun for me to play around with. When it comes to specifically the melee combat though, especially when it comes to per character variety, it has less compared to 5. Let's get the most obvious one out of the way. Headshot stun, melee. Then you have headshot stun and then melee from the back. Then you have quick shot and then melee. Direction with this one doesn't matter, and it's worth noting that this particular melee is the, in quotes, generic melee we talked about earlier that also can happen when you save your partner. This also happens if you get a leg stun on the enemy. Because of all the various ways you can pull it off, I just took to calling it the generic melee to keep things simple, and it's not said in a derogatory way. Then you have the stomp, and it is worth noting that all the characters in this game have the same stomp animations. Unlike Resident Evil 5, which gave every single character unique ground melee attacks. Stomp animations in this game do change based on the weapon, so if you have a one-handed weapon, it's gonna look something like this. But if you have a two-handed weapon, you'll get an animation like this, but it remains the same with other characters. This game also has a finisher style move, much like Resident Evil 5, and the way you pull it off varies per enemy, but for simplicity's sake, here's how you can do it by yourself. Quick shot, then slide into an enemy, making sure to hit them with that slide, and then make sure to melee them from the front, because a back melee might chain into a normal headshot back melee move, if that makes sense. Another way to do it is to melee backwards when you have your back to an enemy, and the follow-up should be this finisher. This finisher animation can actually also show up when you're saving your partner from an enemy, but once again, there's no dedicated partner save melee. So far, this is 5 melee moves so far that you can do to an enemy in front of you, like an average enemy, like a zombie. And there's one thing that I haven't mentioned yet because it feels like it should be in its own category, and that's parries. If you time it right, you're able to press a button to counterattack with a special melee move that you can't do otherwise. So because of that, I'm actually gonna count this alongside the unique melee moves with this game, unlike with Resident Evil 4 Remake, because again, knife parries in that game are the same across all the characters. And funny thing, Leon and Sherry happen to reuse a couple of animations from each other, so that's less variety, and someone like Agent has a moveset that's just a mishmash of a bunch of the other characters. But let's throw that to the side for now. To my knowledge, this is the extent of the prompt-based melee attacks, specifically in RE6. In this game, you're also able to just do melee attacks without prompts, which is really neat, but I'm not factoring those into the equation because we're only talking about prompt-based melee attacks. Like you're specifically told, press button to see something cool, like after a stun or something. I kind of briefly mentioned this, but it is worth mentioning again that Resident Evil 6 completely gets rid of the partner melee comboing system, so you can't chain melee attacks together on one enemy anymore like you could in 5. Like, you can go ham on an enemy together, but it's not gonna result in like a certain string of combos that leads to a finisher or something like that. At least not in the same way. Resident Evil 5 is also the only game besides the original Resident Evil 4 and Mercenaries 3D that gives names to each melee attack, which is a very small thing that I really like because it gives a flavor to each of the characters. Chris has very straightforward names like Uppercut, Neck Breaker, Hook, Stomp, and so on. And then you move on to Wesker and you get something like Cobra Strike or Tiger Uppercut. Then Barry has a move called Barry Sandwich or Hurricane. This is the kind of thing that might be insignificant to somebody out there, but to me it's just, it adds flavor. I like it. So in conclusion, with Resident Evil 5, when you're about to do a melee attack, there's multiple purposes that it can be used for. Number 1, are you just doing a melee attack for damage? And number 2, are you doing a melee attack to chain it with a partner? And number 3, are you doing melee attacks to intentionally suppress the chance of a parasite coming out? Question 1 applies to any and all Resident Evil games that have any form of prompt-based melee attacks. Question 2 simply does not exist for any Resident Evil other than 5 and Mercenaries 3D. Question 3 is on a case-to-case basis even in Resident Evil 5's case. So for example, in Resident Evil 5, the majority of the characters, when it comes to the leg stun with a melee attack done from the back, they will do a melee attack that suppresses the parasite. So like Chris has the neck breaker, Sheva has the throat slit, but then Wesker doesn't have an attack like that. It's just a normal kind of attack. So parasites will still have a chance to show up. But even in spite of all of this, the one game that is the most organized about melee attacks is Resident Evil 5. I believe head stun melee attacks in Resident Evil 6 also can suppress transformations, but it's been a minute since I went hardcore into Resident Evil 6, so I could be wrong about that. In Resident Evil 4 Remake, you can suppress the parasite unless you use the knife, which once again is a finite resource. But there's a couple of exceptions like Leon's suplex or like Hunk's neckbreaker. Something not exactly related to melee attacks that I wanted to give a shout out to in Resident Evil 5 is that it's the only game I can currently think of where you have not only insane freedom with reloading at all times, but you're also able to freely manage your inventory on the fly. This may not sound very impressive, but in high-level play for Resident Evil 5, especially in Mercenaries, this will come in extremely handy. Hear me out. You're able to reload in the middle of a melee attack because this game's inventory doesn't pause the game. So this means you're able to reload while climbing ladders, you're able to reload while jumping platforms, you're able to reload while being attacked, making full use of that recovery animation time, you're able to reload while picking up the ammo that you're lacking, and fully finish reloading by the time you're done with your pickup animation. This doesn't stop at just reloading. You're also able to combine herbs since you can access your inventory on the fly anyway, and you're able to better place place your items if need be. Honestly, this is one aspect of Resident Evil 5 that I don't see being appreciated enough, and if I have to be the one that puts it out there, so be it. Thank you, Resident Evil 5. I'm not gonna talk much about Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D in this video, but just know that it works very similarly to Resident Evil 5, so it carries over a lot of its variety. I'm only briefly gonna cover Requiem, but in that game, both Grace and Leon have melee attacks, and you may be surprised to hear that I'm mentioning Grace. Her, in quotes, melee attacks actually can deal damage, but it's like a super tiny amount that it doesn't matter. She has a push animation for the head stun, and then a kick animation for the leg stun. Leon has head stun melee attacks and leg stun melee attacks very similar to how it worked in Resident Evil 4 Remake, and it can slightly vary based on how far you are from the zombie. And this game also adds wall executions. If you melee an enemy near a wall, Leon will push them to that wall and occasionally stomp on their heads. But that stomp doesn't always happen, which results in a somewhat awkward animation where you have to finish them off afterwards. I actually spent a good chunk of time trying to get a proper wall execution, but I kept getting the awkward variant every single time. Or other times I try and face the wall and I just don't get it. I'm not sure if I'd put it in the same ballpark, but this game does also have some very cool looking gun executions, so there's that. Though they do have the condition that the enemy has to be at low HP, so maybe I wouldn't count them. The hatchet melee moves work similarly to how they did in 4 Remake as well, and it's a finite resource, so you know how that goes. Leon also has a bunch of environmental attacks in this game, very similar to Resident Evil 6. But anyway, if I were to sit here and yap all day about the melee combo systems in a bunch of the Resident Evil games, I would be sitting here all day long, because this is genuinely a rabbit hole when it comes to these Resident Evil games. There's a lot of tech, a lot of specifics that go into the melee attacks. And even with all my knowledge, I believe that I might have not done the topic justice fully. But still, thank you all so much for watching this. I really wanted to just give a big shout out to Resident Evil 5 for being a special game to me, and its melee combat is one of the biggest things that I adore about it. You guys take care now, and I'll see you all in the next video, whatever that is. Bye bye now.